Today on Nigerian social media particularly, there is a very interesting but rather tense cultural exchange going on between Christians and Muslims on the subject of the accusations of genocide being perpetrated against Christians in many parts of particularly northern Nigeria. The gist of the matter is that the Christians essentially accuse the Muslims, by and large, of being complicit in the atrocities being perpetrated against them for targeting Christian and Christian communities, specifically for their beliefs and such. And they target, or rather, they accuse many Muslims of complicity, perhaps by way of being silent, which is often seen as some form of tacit approval for the atrocities or for the killings taking place. And the Muslims are very, very quick to fire back by saying that the terrorists who commit these atrocities are not representative of the faith, and point to similar Christian defenses for people who are found to have committed certain heinous crimes and are devout Christians. And this is a very astute observation because Christians too use these defense. They use this defense when someone within their ranks is exposed for committing a heinous crime. Probably a respected person within the community, like a pastor, for example, a popular pastor, it could be, who is accused of a number of a variety of offenses like corruption or sexual abuse or domestic abuse or ritual killings and so on and so forth. Christians are very quick to come out to say that, oh, well, this person is not representative of our faith. In other words, Christians will tell you that no true Christian would ever do such a thing. And for anyone who claims to be a Christian to have done such a thing, then that person was never a true Christian to begin with. At least that's how the defense goes. This defense restores group confidence, either on the side of the Muslims who are trying to put off terrorism from within their ranks, or from Christians who are trying to put off a slew of different vices that more often than not usually recur. It separates the bad actor from identifying with the group, or at least it tells the members of the group that this bad actor is not a member of our group. And in both cases, such as a Muslim who is denying the identity of a terrorist who professes to be a Muslim, and the Christian who denies the identity of a sex offender who claims to be a Christian, these cases employ a No True Scotsman fallacy. The train of thought goes this way: that no Christian does this, or no Muslim does this. And then when a counterexample is provided that says that, oh, but this person who identifies with this has done that thing, the claim is then modified to say no true Christian or Muslim, or insert any social category, basically, would do this. The No True Scotsman may be sufficient for signaling disapproval by members of the community. In other words, they are trying to tell you that they don't approve of the action that the person who they are trying to tacitly expel, they do not approve of the action that person has taken, which is why they are denying the identity of that person, or at least denying that that person identifies with their community. However, this defense does not work due to particularly the specific way in which these communities are socially constructed, the specific way in which both Christianity and or Islam are socially constructed. In other words, the state of being a Christian or of being a Muslim possesses no clear operational definition that is testable externally, except the profession of being either or none of the above categories. To illustrate this idea a little bit better, let's think about shining an LED at a wall, for example. Let's say we have a red LED shining at a wall, and we want to know, okay, what color is this? And we want to give a word for that color. All of us can come together to look at the color and say, okay, we are going to call this specific color red. However, the question becomes, how can I be sure that what I see as a shade of red is what you see as a shade of red? And then there are people who are colorblind who cannot perceive the color in the same way most of us would perceive the color. And in such a situation, how can we establish that we are agreeing that we are all seeing the same thing? Well, color is light, and light has wavelengths. We can measure the wavelength of light. And once we assign the word red to a specific wavelength of light, it doesn't matter what any of us sees as long as that wavelength is measurable and is present. In other words, the wavelength of that color is the operational definition that we can test to see whether the category, or rather the identifier we have given to something, is correct for describing or for identifying that thing. This is not the case for either Islam or Christianity, or, to be fair, any most other religious beliefs. The reason being that one could decide to say, okay, we could look at the way the person who we want to find out their religion, and we want to know what religion this person belongs to. So we are going to look at how they dress or how they behave and so on. In fact, even Christianity is very famous for the statement, by their fruits you shall know them, and so on and so forth, except for the fact that this can lead to erroneous identification and to false positives. I mean, many of us are familiar with one or two people who we think appears like one or the other of these religious beliefs, and are not members of those religious communities that we think that they identify with. Plus, the amount of variation in the beliefs that, rather, the amount of internal variation within the communities of either Islam or Christianity shows us that there is no one true way to be a Christian or one true way to be a Muslim, and so on and so forth. In other words, the statement of no true this can do this is meaningless. To illustrate this idea even further, let's think about certification. Because if you want to talk about whether someone is a true something, if you're a true Christian or a true Muslim or a true anything, a true Nigerian or a true man or a true woman, and so on and so forth, one of the things we need is some sort of certification. For example, professional bodies, professional occupations like medicine or law or engineering and so on. They have professional central bodies that can certify the validity of an individual's membership, and certify that they possess the privileges and rights to practice the profession in question, either medicine or law, and so on and so forth. So in other words, if we want to know if someone is a certified doctor who is allowed to, practice medicine and so on, we can simply ask the medical association, does this person belong to you? And then they would be the ones to make the determination that, yeah, okay, this person belongs to this person is a member of our community, and so on. However, when we press either Muslims or Christians for this sort of certification to show how there is no clear operational definition for their state as being Muslim or Christian, what we find is that we have an appeal to the supernatural. My certification, rather, as either of these two categories lies with God, which is essentially useless, because we cannot certify that. Anybody can claim to be certified by God, but nobody can just claim to be certified to be a doctor, a licensed doctor specifically, because if you do and we find out that you are not, there is very real risk of prosecution, right? Right. So I think there is a benefit in accepting that the people who commit crimes, either terrorism or or domestic abuse or corruption or murder and so on and so forth are members of the community that they profess to be members of. In other words, a terrorist who says he is a Muslim, and a child abuser who says he is a Christian, and there is no point in trying to deflect from that reality. And I believe that we often resort to the No True Scotsman defense in order to soothe the dissonance that comes from moralizing identity. In other words, being a Christian or Muslim, technically speaking or strictly speaking, shouldn't be seen as having somewhat like moral positions, or shouldn't be moralized in of themselves. But most people tend to do so. Most people tend to expect that someone who identifies as a Christian has certain moral qualities, and someone who identifies as being a Muslim has certain moral qualities, when in reality this should not be the case. And so when we have that idea that these identities, when we have moralized these identities and we find someone who does not conform with the idea of what these identities are in our minds, the dissonance that causes a lot of people to fall back onto the No True Scotsman by saying, oh no, this person cannot be a true, because if he was a true, he would not do what he has done. And so I think that the No True Scotsman allows for disengagement with the issues present with people committing heinous crimes and so on. I think it leaves responsibility outside the door. It does not allow communities to really sit down to introspect and to see why certain things keep recurring from their communities. Now, the second thing we would like to talk about is, particularly when speaking about terrorism, especially terrorism in Nigeria, there is the idea that the terrorists find the endorsement for their activity from within Islamic scripture. And many Muslims will be the first to tell you that, oh no, the terrorists are wrong. Islam is a religion of peace, and we are taught to coexist with our neighbors irrespective of their identity, irrespective of their religious beliefs, and so on and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, there are indeed passages used by extremists within Islamic scripture. We could make the argument that these passages or these verses and so on are taken out of context or are reinterpreted to fit the rhetorical goals of the terrorist or the extremists. However, this argument is toothless because of the specific way in which religions, especially these religions, are socially constructed. For example, if we have a professional body of lawyers or a professional body of doctors, these bodies would have their code of ethics, they would have their code of conduct, and how they are to conduct themselves and how they are to behave and so on, right? These ethics codes may contain problematic clauses that could lend themselves to being misused, or that could lend themselves to giving justification for criminal behavior. However, we could push that these ethics codes, that those clauses that are specifically problematic, that we could push for their removal, we could push for editing them out in the interest of the safety of the community that these individuals are meant to serve, and so on. We cannot do that for either Islam or Christianity because, one, there is no central body we can appeal to. Two, there is an inherent rigidity within the way most adherents of these beliefs engage with their religious texts. These texts are meant to be infallible, they are meant to be perfect, and so on. And so we cannot remove these things, which makes the argument that people are taking these things out of context and or reinterpreting them incorrectly, makes these arguments toothless. Because in reality, who do we appeal to get the correct reading or interpretation? A professional body or so on and so forth would have we would have a central body to appeal to tell us what this clause in their ethics code mean, or we would appeal to the courts, for example, in a national system to tell us what specific clauses in the constitution mean, and so on. But who do we appeal to? So that's a problem. Mainstream ideas is that Islam is a tolerant religion, and mainstream ideas also have it that Christianity is a tolerant religion, and the fringe ideas are that they are intolerant, right? It's difficult to suggest that either of them could be intolerant. However, I do want to say that despite the claims of tolerance and the despite the assertions that, oh, we live peacefully, in fact, even Christians are commanded to love your neighbor as yourself. Despite all of this, what we obtain realistically is far from that ideal in many cases, particularly within the Nigerian context. For example, if we want to talk about tolerance, we could talk about it from, the tradition of these religions, or we could look to their texts to see how tolerant and whether their ideas of tolerance or intolerance and so on and so forth. And one of the glaring examples I like to give for Islam specifically is the 21st surah of the Quran, where Ibrahim is described as living among idolatrous people, and he points out their apparent error of worshipping non-living physical objects. Although his argument of non-living physical objects is technically a caricature of what idols are meant to be, but that aside, that's a very, very different discussion entirely. But he makes the identification, and when no one is looking, he tears down the idols and tears down the statues of these people, and he draws their anger, and they throw him into a fire that's made cool. The fire is made cool, just in the same way the fire was made cool in the narrative in the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. However, the act of pulling down the idols of a people group who have, you would say, a different religion, so to speak, is not very tolerant behavior. Similarly, Christians would tell you about their tolerance and their coexistence with other groups that have differing faiths from them. However, in the body of their own text, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we have people groups targeted for extermination, particularly and perhaps specifically because of idolatry. Not very, very tolerant, you would say. And this spills over into how Christians tend to behave, especially in Nigeria, where we are steeped in superstition. We see how Christians behave towards things that they tag as witchcraft. It could be different religious beliefs, traditional religious beliefs, and the tag of witchcraft gives legitimacy to go after those things when the opportunity presents itself. And we also see how this intolerance bleeds into like public life. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, Jumat services on Friday can be conducted in ways where they disrupt public life. Roads are converted to praying grounds and so on. And so the ordinary person who is just moving on his own has his day interrupted. For example, churches can cordon entire areas off for their use, maybe for parking lots or for crusades, or have speakers that are so loud they do not care about the health and wellness about their immediate surrounding. And this can lead us into this leads us into our next point of discussion. So the next point of discussion is Nigeria's state as a secular nation. Nigeria is a secular country in our constitution, on paper anyway. However, the reality could not be further from the truth. And what it means to be a secular country is that Our country doesn't give any special regard to any religion. Our country doesn't give any special regard or special consideration to even the absence of religion, because we have had in this world in the past and even up till today, atheist states that promote the lack of religious belief and so on. So a secular country doesn't promote either of these spectrums, either ends of this spectrum, right? However, this is not this doesn't really agree with the reality of the matter on ground in Nigeria. For example, the most glaring example one can give as to the state of our actual non-secularism is the fact that in 12 northern states in this country, we have Sharia used as some sort of judicial code alongside a civil, perhaps a non-religious secular code of law and so on, to varying degrees in this country, right? And this is an endorsement of one faith over all the others. In other words, we are being told that there are specific states in the country that are Islamic states. In other words, we have Islamic subunits of a secular nation, a blatant contradiction. However, many people do make the argument that, oh, well, Sharia law use is not necessarily a problem because, well, it only applies to Muslims within its jurisdiction. And to them, I would like to throw them a challenge and ask them to do one of a few things. One, I would like them to endorse the use of other types of religious law within the states where Sharia is used to back up the idea that we are really a secular country and that no one religion is put above the other. For example, let us find a version of Christian religious law to implement at the state level for the Christians in the state so that they do not feel discriminated against. Let us even find some version of, I don't know, animist law that is employed by the animists in northern Nigeria, the Maguzawa. Let us implement it statewide so that those animists, few as they are, know that they are also considered equal within the system, right? And let us see how well that would go. However, even when we say that, well, Sharia doesn't affect every other person, it only affects the Muslims, we still see certain parts of that system, so to speak, act in ways that are intolerant to people of other faiths. For example, we have the Hisbah religious police in many states in the north, particularly notoriously Kano State, where we see the Hisbah police rounding up loads of alcohol and burning them because apparently alcohol is prohibited under Islamic religious law. However, not everybody in Kano State is a Muslim, which means not everybody in Kano State is prohibited from taking alcohol. And so, doing that is, in a sense, signaling to others that, well, your beliefs are perhaps not welcome, not very welcome here, right? And we also see this bleeding of church into state, so to speak, when we see how state governors use taxpayer money to send people on religious pilgrimages every year. And we claim we have a secular republic. That is just not the case. However, this leads me to something else. And this is actually quite tenuous to approach, which is the idea of supremacy. In every other facet of life, wherever we see supremacist beliefs, we try to call them out, we try to cut them down as much as possible, as much as we can. Think about racism. Racism is based on supremacy. Racism is based on the idea that certain people with certain colors of skin are less or are greater than than the others. And the most notorious example of racism is white supremacy. Everybody knows white supremacy. Let's talk about gender supremacy. The idea that being born a man makes you superior to every woman on the planet by virtue of your maleness. So wherever we find supremacy, we tend to fight, or at least we try to fight supremacy, but not so with religious belief. Because the truth of the matter is, both Islam and Christianity, which make up roughly half of Nigeria's population, depending on who you ask, are blatantly supremacist belief systems. Blatantly supremacist in the sense that they believe they have the knowledge of something that others do not, that makes them superior to others. They believe they have access to beings, to a being that others do not, special access that others do not, that makes them superior to all others. And this is essentially supremacy. Supremacy lies at the core of both these belief systems. And we can see it in how they behave and in how they interact, with how Christians and Muslims interact within the in-group and with outsiders. We see Christian lingo, for example, the way they talk about things that are external to Christianity, words being used such as the unbeliever or the heathen. Even sometimes the word secular can have a negative connotation for some reason, even though it normally shouldn't. Worldly and such. Christians believe they are set apart, they are more moral than those who do not identify as Christians, simply because they are Christians, and as such they are meant to interact with those who are not part of the fold in very specific ways and shouldn't shy from imposing their beliefs whenever the opportunity presents itself. Similarly with Islam, there are the words used to describe the outsiders, and in many cases these words, they technically aren't derogatory on their own, but the way they are being used across the spectrum from Christianity to Islam is in a way that suggests that these words have become slurs. And so we see these behaviors, the way they behave towards outsiders, the haughtiness with which these people, with which adherents particularly carry themselves. So supremacy is at the heart of these beliefs, and if there's supremacy anywhere, it is a breeding ground for trouble eventually. This is the root of Nigeria's religious tension. You mix supremacist beliefs with a country having a large population of incredibly poor people, high poverty, high unemployment, terrible education, and so many more things. We essentially are sitting on what is a time bomb. The aspects of the state of society that should control the level of expression of supremacy, we do not have those safeguards essentially. The final thing I do want to talk about is my bone of contention with Christians specifically, particularly on being persecuted. I mean, there's a lot of material evidence that shows, in fact, that there's Christian persecution in Nigeria, and a lot of Christian communities are targeted for their faith. Although I believe in many ways it is more complex than that. I believe there is still the ethnic angle to the targeted killings and so on and so forth. I believe there is indeed an ethnic angle to it, so such that we have what is essentially an ethno-religious issue on our hands. But yes, there is indeed a lot of material evidence to suggest that yes, this is the case. But there is something else that I want to talk about, which is how Christian theology works and how Christians in Nigeria are negotiating with, the content of Christian text and Christian theology. For example, we talk about the communities that are being attacked. We talk about how these communities are, being placed under the mercy of the killers who raid at night. We think about them, we recoil in horror as thinking about a family sleeping peacefully at night only to wake up to their building or their house being burnt over their heads, or to seeing loved ones being hacked to pieces before being killed in cold blood by the terrorists who are perpetrating these acts. We think about the pain these people feel. We think about their suffering, and it drives us to action. However, in Christian text, particularly the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament as it were, we have vivid descriptions of violent conquest directed at any people groups specifically because of their description of being idolatrous. In other words, many people groups are being commanded to be exterminated because they are idolatrous, right? In other words, the same situation we have with Christian communities in Nigeria, where many innocent civilians are at the mercy of mindless killers, as it were. That same situation is what members of the communities to whom extermination was commanded upon would find themselves in. And Christians don't read the Hebrew Bible, especially passages in the Hebrew Bible that contains these vivid descriptions in this way. We do not humanize these people. We do not empathize with these people. Once we place the label of idolatrous upon them, then they are fair game. And, you know, humanizing and empathizing with the plight of these people, which is similar to the plight of Christians in Christian communities in Nigeria today, reveals some tension with our beliefs and so on. The second thing is that Christians are championing the anti-persecution push. Christians don't want to be persecuted in Nigeria for a very good reason. However, it's funny to me because persecution is supposed to be part of the package, isn't it? The most authoritative voice in Christian faith and tradition had predicted persecution for all who would become a member or become part of the faith. However, Christians are disengaged from this. No more rejoicing for being persecuted for being a Christian, but rather calls for justice, which is ironic, essentially, because Christians today do not want to participate in what the most authoritative voice in the entire faith and tradition has said would be a consequence of being a Christian. And I think these are things that we probably should do some introspection on. Yeah.